Welcome on board Sputnik with me, Hafsa Mustafa.
And me, Gayatri.
You probably would have a better force if you recruited entirely from England, but it can't be afforded. So you go from the Midlands of England to Nepalese Asians, and then at some point you say, I'm afraid all we can afford now is Africans. No, this isn't an extract from one of Rudyard Kipling's more obscure novels. These were the words of former British Army officer James Ellery defending Aegis's decision to recruit possible former child soldiers from Sierra Leone.
A Danish television documentary revealed how a major British private defense contractor may have recruited former child soldiers to work as security guards on American bases in Iraq. In The Child Soldier's New Job, which aired this month, it was claimed that Aegis, which is chaired by Sir Nicholas Soames, the Tory MP and grandson of Winston Churchill, hired some 2,500 mercenaries on as little as £10 a day in order to fulfill contracts to guard US military bases from 2004 onwards.
Who better to shed light on this extraordinary story than former British soldier and news correspondent Joe Glenton. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Joe, the story involves a Tory grandee, a major figure of the British establishment. It's received quite little coverage in the British media. But before we go into the actual details of the story, first of all, what are the legal frameworks in which these kind of operations actually operate in war zones?
There is, I mean, that's the central issue, I think. There is very little regulation. Mercenary companies, we should call them what they are, avoid and resist any kind of legislation. They talk about self-regulation quite a lot, but as we're seeing in this example and lots of others since the mercenary gold rush immediately after the Iraq War, there is no regulation, there's very little oversight, and they have friends in high places.
The filmmaker actually says that his desire really is to expose the goings-on of these mercenary operations through this documentary. Do you believe that actually this will work, really? Will it raise the awareness of the public opinion?
Well, it won't do any harm, I think, and it's important to expose. I mean, Soames is a very interesting character in himself, but I think the more interesting character, who is a character directly out of Rudyard Kipling, is Brigadier Ellery, and he's a very interesting character. I don't know if you saw the recent adaptation of The Night Manager, but the aristocratic arms dealer at the centre of it, Richard Roper, was branded the worst man in the world. And if that was a real title, this guy could probably compete. I mean, he served in one of the most elite regiments in the British Army. He was an aide-de-camp to Lord Mountbatten. He's an absolute establishment figure. And interestingly, part of his background, he also worked for the UN, and during that time he was part of the group which demobilised child soldiers in Sierra Leone, which disarmed them and tried to help them re-enter society. And now it sounds like he's kind of cashing in off that, which is a particularly kind of vulture-like way to conduct business. I mean,
he's defended the decision, claiming that you can't actually, control the situation.
He has defended it in the most interesting, in the most Flashman-like Rudyard Kipling imperialist terms, because he's almost talking about hiring mercenaries in a place like Sierra Leone, where the unemployment is very high, as a kind of something which supports those people's human rights and is a kind of humanitarian act. And that is precisely where this man exists, at the meeting point between humanitarian operations, the UN, etc., and the private military industry, the war industry. And he seems to flip very easily between both worlds.
What is alarming, though, is because obviously these kids are picked up at 18, just to the point where they're actually legally, it is legal for them to operate in these war zones. It means that they've actually received training as child soldiers, so they're ripe for the picking when they're 18. And in other words, because they're offered, well, supposedly lucrative jobs coming out from Sierra Leone, it actually encourages child soldiers to work at the, from the age of 12 or 13, and then be right to be picked up by a mercenary company later on.
I think it does. I mean, it's deeply sinister that these children who've been badly traumatised potentially are now being thrown into another war zone where they're armed again and maybe even more badly traumatised. I mean, they're not a known measure. You don't know what will happen. But it reminds me, again, it has this kind of colonial kind of colouring to it. It's almost like years ago it was send in the Irish, send in the cheapest, send in the expendables, send in the Africans, send in the Indians, the Gurkhas. And it seems to be, based on profit margins, a kind of reprisal of that. So they're sending the, you know, the cannon fodder, literally. I mean, maybe it shouldn't surprise us. We're in Britain, we're one of the last countries that still recruits child soldiers ourselves. People under 18, though there's a campaign to stop that now. But it seems to be really about profit
So from
margins.
what age? From 16, you would say?
Originally it was 15 and a half. There's a drive to get it higher and higher and higher so that people can't be recruited.
And we're the last country in the world.
One of the last countries in Europe. It does seem to be a reflection of this kind of backwards ruling class, Soames-Ellery mentality, send in the expendable cannon fodder.
I always thought this mercenary concept is very dodgy. I mean, it has to be based on profit, because otherwise, why would you go in the front in a war, into a war zone if not for the money, leaving your family behind? But the way you talk about it, it's like an agent, yeah? It's like an agent group just sending out.
And it's, I mean, as I said, immediately after what we're seeing is the tail end of the mercenary gold rush. Iraq was flooded. People who were nightclub bouncers were turning up with a rifle and saying, I've had military service, lying about it. There was a huge, and it's still a multi-million-dollar industry, but we seem to be at the tail end of that. But of course, mercenaries also fit into the kind of new, the various strands which the government has had to adopt, because it's very unpopular to send soldiers in. Mass occupations like Iraq and Afghanistan where I served. So people aren't sympathetic towards mercenaries, and it's another strand for how the war on terror is being fought now. You have the mercenaries, you have the special forces, you have drones, you have cyber warfare, you have airstrikes, because they can't afford to commit large amounts of troops. It's very unpopular. It's death in the kind of limited democracy we have here.
And in the case of Tony Blair, it's also a political suicide.
Yeah, exactly. You know, so it's a kind of it's a fallback, but of course it has impacts in Iraq and in Africa.
Coming back on the issue of the war on terror, okay, there is it's very opaque within the war zones, the legal framework, but in Britain it's very clear. Isn't there, at least very officially, a conflict of interest when you have lawmakers actually voting for wars and then going on to profit from the post-war sort of...
Sure. I mean, I think Brigadier Ellery is a brilliant example of this. Though he's not a lawmaker, but he's an example of this strange dynamic. And Soames as well. But I know Ellery was involved in Paul Bremer, who set up the kind of colonial administration in Iraq. He was part of his staff. And I mean, there is a huge conflict of interest, but it really depends what we can do about it and how we can legislate for it. But again, there does have to be a framework. And you're right. I mean, it's outrageous that people are voting for wars and then profiting from it, though it's not new.
Is there some sort of campaign to raise awareness about the situation?
Some very good work has been done. I remember there was a report in January by War on One, a charity you're probably familiar with, and they did a big investigative report, which they often do, and they do it very well, into the mercenary industry in the UK and how close it is. I think there are various companies up in Hereford next to the headquarters of the Special Air Service, and they recruit directly out of there. So this stuff is going on, it is being exposed, but of course, I mean, and this is why the use of mercenaries is so popular, because people don't have the same sympathy. But I mean, there are campaigns, people are trying to do it. I know I'm in a group of veterans who are committed to peace activism. We try and touch on it as well.
And are they working perhaps with African governments?
I mean, if they're not, they should start. I don't know exactly what the terrain looks like there in terms of activism and trying to get things done. But fundamentally, it has to be legislated for, and these people have to be controlled.
I understand you served in Afghanistan. Was there a sort of similar scenario going on in Afghanistan?
There was lots of mercenaries in Afghanistan, though sometimes it's hard to pick out who's a mercenary and who's special forces, because they have this kind of quasi-uniform of half military equipment and a rifle and then half civilian, so jeans and a camouflage shirt. And both of those groups wear the same thing. But there's also a broader issue, I think, not just of military personnel.
Where were they mostly from, though, the mercenaries?
A lot of them were UK, lots of South Africans, Americans and people like that, with big ZZ top beards and sawn-off weapons.
What's the rapport between actual official soldiers and these mercenaries?
In certain units, like the Royal Marines and the elite units, those guys would know people. I have friends from those kind of units who also spent time as mercenaries out in Iraq or Afghanistan and in Africa and other places, Libya. Nigeria is a big one as well. But there's actually a kind of... the military at one point was very, very concerned that it was losing highly trained special forces personnel because the mercenary companies were competing with them and saying, well, we'll give you even more money to do this far easier job, guarding an installation, guarding a convoy. But it's a very advanced and very wealthy industry, and the government is involved. I understand in 2012, the Foreign Office spent £50 million of taxpayers' money on private security for its various installations in embassies and things like that.
If
So
only
they're
the
all-
public knew that.
Yeah, well, this
That
is it.
number is-
And you're right, it's underreported, and people need to know, because in that case, it's taxpayers' money.
Yeah, exactly.
There's talk, obviously, of sending further troops in Libya in order to sort of try and rectify the mess that was caused back in 2011. Do you believe that part of this would be sort of in collaboration with some of these companies to profit from the situation and send these mercenary companies?
I suspect companies like Aegis and G4S, who we all know, are waiting with bated breath to descend on Libya. My view is to send in any kind of... The SAS are already there, we know that. But to send in any kind of troops to Libya as a component in an Italian brigade, given the history of Italy and Libya, would be somewhere between Rorke's Drift and Black Hawk Down. It would be an absolute disaster.
With austerity biting now and, you know, unemployment rising, do you believe that at some point we'll be seeing sort of British squaddies treated a bit like the African child soldiers and sent off for under 20 quid a day?
Maybe, potentially. I mean, it's very difficult to say. A lot of soldiers leave the military to absolute poverty and they have nothing. But I think, at least in the estimation of Brigadier Ellery, he would rather have British soldiers. So I think that they would cost slightly more. But I mean, who can say what's going to happen in the economic climate we have now?
But do you think there'd be opposition, I mean, or perhaps in this sort of class warfare going on and the idea that you can send African kids or perhaps working class kids, then there would be the idea would be perfectly acceptable?
Maybe. I mean, you've got to see how it pans out, but it's possible.
But it would be interesting because at the very least that would raise awareness in British public and
so,
probably sort of create opposition to this practice.
Sure. But I mean, again, there is a political imperative behind this. It's very painful to see white British soldiers or former soldiers dying. That's very unpopular. It's easier to send in the Irish, send in the people of colour, and so on. It's politically an easier ride for the people who back these mercenary companies and vote for wars.
Thank you very much, Joe Glenton.
Coming up next, Trouble in Paradise. We'll be talking about the latest in Brazil. Stay tuned.
Welcome back on board the Sputnik. It was supposed to be the highlight of 2016, but less than 4 months to go before the Olympic opening ceremony in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and the Games have now been reduced to an insignificant talking point. Earlier this month, 73% of the lower house of Congress voted in favour of Dilma Rousseff's impeachment, thrusting the president's Workers' Party into disarray.
Although initially a popular politician, Rousseff began to suffer increasing criticism in Congress and in the press as Brazil's once formidable status among the world's foremost economies went into reverse.
The PT's ambitious social housing program, aimed at benefiting the poorest, was funded by oil and a commodities boom that began some 15 years ago.
However, with Brazil slipping into recession in 2015, coupled with a corruption investigation implicating politicians from all parties, the South American nation's shining star has begun to falter.
The BRICS club, once most promising country, is in crisis. To understand how this is likely to impact South America and beyond is Peruvian-born journalist and media specialist Javier Farje. Javier, welcome on board the Sputnik.
Thank you for having me.
Dilma Rousseff was the heir of Lula,
Exactly.
who came, who left brilliant mandate. Now, where did it all go wrong for Dilma?
Well, as you mentioned in your introduction, the sort of the decline and the boom of commodities export, mainly because of China's economic woes, in a way contributed to the situation. The other thing is that she was not Lula. She could not match the charisma and also she could not inherit the economic growth that Lula had and enabled him to afford social programs while he was following more or less orthodox economic policies. And that created, Brazil has the strongest domestic market in Latin America. Therefore, the dependency on exports was not as big as it like Peru or other countries in the region. And that people started to lose confidence. The consumers started to lose confidence. That affected investment. So there was kind of like a domino effect that made it, possible for the economy to start going down. The corruption scandal that you mentioned. Now we have to point out very clearly, as you rightly said, that it seems that every political party, members of every political party in Brazil are involved in this corruption scandal. At least 60% of MPs, of members of parliament, have something to do with this scandal of corruption. However, Dilma has not been touched by it directly. There's no evidence that she has been involved in corruption.
But she's been leading the country and sort of almost allowed the climate in which this corruption sort of festered.
That is the criticism they make of her, that she let the whole thing go, that she didn't come hard on the actual investigation of this corruption, that members of the Workers' Party were involved in that and she did nothing about it. When she was in Petrobras, which is the origin of the big oil state-owned company, which is at the core of this corruption scandal, she was in the board before she became president. She was not corrupt, that she did not control certain trading sort of, operations that the company had that led to corruption things. So yes, she's been accused basically of being negligent. The reasons for the impeachment, we have to be very clear, many independent analysts consider they are not strong enough for her to be impeached. She's been accused of cooking the books to make the economy look better than it was. Now, we have that experience in the UK. Every government does that. Yeah. But basically, there's an element of people being tired of the corruption, and they use this as a reason, as an excuse, if you like, to impeach her. At the same time, all the other parties that were part of the coalition, because of the corruption scandal, they didn't feel that they were able to stay in the coalition. So she was getting more and more isolated. And as a result of this situation, we have this impeachment, which is not helping the economy, by the way, because people are starting to... when there's political instability in the country, people say, well, we don't want to invest there.
So I'm trying to understand how this economic crisis is being displayed in society. You said earlier that Rousseff is not like Lula, just as Maduro is not Chavez. These are huge stars, difficult to follow. Well, in Venezuela, it's very obvious. We read constantly how they are literally out of toilet paper, out of bread. It's very, very, very tangible. I just remember recently from the scenes in Brazil about the protests, about bus fares. How is it displaying in society?
Well, okay, you would mention Venezuela. We have to understand that one of the reasons why the situation is so bad in Venezuela is low oil prices in the international markets. That has affected hugely because the budgets in Venezuela are planned based on the current price of oil. There's no money.
But this is what's worrying about Brazil, because obviously Venezuela is an oil-dependent economy, right. But Brazil wasn't, and it actually managed very efficiently to expand.
Absolutely. That is that's why because the internal market was so strong and the internal market started to collapse, that's when the economy started to go wrong, and we have the biggest recession in Brazil since the 1930s. That is the problem. You see, and of course that has a domino effect in Latin America because many countries that trade with Brazil cannot do it anymore because the internal market is really, really collapsing. There is lack of confidence from the consumer. There's lack of confidence from the part of the investors. The political instability is making things even worse because even after the impeachment was voted in by Parliament, the business sector was saying, "Oh, now the economy is going to start going up." Well, it hasn't. The stock markets in Brazil have not gone up because of the impeachment. On the contrary, they need political stability. So once the internal market in Brazil collapses and starts going wrong, that's when it's difficult for the government to sort of solve it.
It's understandable that Dilma Rousseff would want to challenge these decisions, but isn't she sort of doing her country a disservice by remaining, and maybe it would be a sort of patriotic decision for her to step down at this moment and clear the air, perhaps?
But you have to also question the legitimacy of the impeachment process to understand why Dilma Rousseff is resisting. She was democratically elected. Sure. Now, when you have a member of parliament quoting and praising an army officer who tortured Dilma Rousseff when Dilma Rousseff was a political prisoner to justify the impeachment, there's something very wrong with the opposition. And you understand why the Workers' Party are reluctant to let Rousseff fall. Yeah. Because there's a lot of personal vendetta against her, but also you have these far-right and right-wing MPs who want to bring her down. And many of them want to cover their own tracks because they are involved in corruption themselves. So by impeaching her, they are also distracting the attention from the actual investigation of this scandal. Yes, I'm not saying that Dilma Rousseff has done a very good job. She has been clumsy. If we could use that word, in managing the situation because she doesn't have the charisma and the abilities that President Lula had. But on the other hand, the opposition is not offering an alternative. And that is why, and she's still followed by millions. Don't forget that Brazil is a very polarized country. Yeah. If you go to Brasilia, before the debates in parliament, they had to build a metal wall that crossed almost all the capital of Brazil to separate pro and anti-Dilma. And that wall is a metaphor of the divisions that happen in Brazil between the poor north, where there's a lot of landlords and poor people, and the rich south. And that's reflected in the whole thing. So, yes, you can criticize Dilma for what she's done, but at the same time, that doesn't give the opposition, especially the rival opposition, the legitimacy they claim to have, that we are heroes of democracy. Well, sorry, but if you're praising an army officer who tortured Dilma Rousseff when she was fighting for democracy, I'm not really sure you can claim any kind of moral, ethical standards or any moral authority to impeach the president. So I understand why she's resisting this movement.
And do you feel that she can survive?
No, I think it's very difficult. I think it's going to be very difficult for her to survive, because if the Senate approves the impeachment process, then the trial will start and then she might have to go. There could be a compromise, maybe. It looks very difficult at the moment. Nothing, I mean, Brazilian politics are very unpredictable, so anything could happen, but it doesn't look good for her. It doesn't look good.
She has, of course, a very strong right-wing opposition.
Yes.
I'm curious to what extent foreign elements are involved in that.
It doesn't suit the US to have a political crisis in Brazil. Now, even Bush got along pretty well with Lula, because the US, we're talking about the US here, let's face it. Brazil is the biggest economy in Latin America. Yeah. Before Lula became president, Brazil was quite isolated from the rest of Latin America for historical reasons. They speak Portuguese, they were conquered by Portugal, the rest of Latin America, Spanish, etc., etc. But Lula started to integrate Brazil more into the Latin American family, if you want to use that expression. Which means that Brazil has had a great deal of influence in the rest of, especially South America. It doesn't suit the US to have political instability in Brazil. So I don't really think it's in the interest of the US to destabilize Brazil, because at the end of the day, Lula was very conciliatory in terms of trading agreements with the US, and he was criticized by some part of the left for being too nice to the Americans. But at the same time, there are people who outside Brazil might be interested, like the right wings in Colombia or Venezuela, to let Brazil fall, because that would help against Maduro.
So just one last point, rather briefly. How will the sort of, well, not collapse really, but this crisis of Brazil, how will it impact the rest of South America?
A lot, because
and the Olympics. Well,
yes, I mean, she might still be president when the Olympics take place, because of the whole impeachment process is quite long. But it would be a lame duck sort of president one. In terms of the rest of Latin America, because everybody has been looking up at Brazil, then people will feel a bit lost, like, okay, our biggest economy, the biggest country has collapsed, what are we going to do about this? UNASUR, which is the unity of the organization that unifies South American countries, would probably rally around Brazil, because nobody can afford to let Brazil collapse. Yeah. It's far too big, far too important, far too rich, far too, relevant for them to let it down. So maybe the other Latin American countries might try to mediate, to find some kind of compromise, because there's no leader in the opposition in Brazil, like it happens in Venezuela, who might be able to take over and say, yes, I am going to save this. None of them are capable to do that.
On this one, I'm afraid we have to leave it. Thank you very much, Javier. You've been a great guest. Now, you've heard from our experts. Let's see what the Twitter sphere has to say. Gayatri?
Well, we asked what actually can be done to stop child soldiers being used in conflicts and war zones. Stephen Gibb says ceasing foreign aid to the countries responsible would be a start. And Jay Shinger says, well, stop selling the bad guys weapons.
That sounds a bit like victim blaming, because obviously selling arms to countries that are being exploited doesn't make much sense.
I agree. But then Graham McAdams says a higher quality of world leaders, that would be a better option, because that's really what's supervising this all, right? Under which this is happening.
Something we'd all like, actually, yes.
On Latin America, Jason Allender says, it seems like the USA is getting its death grip back on Latin America. And that's what it seems like to me as well.
I have to say, I do slightly agree, even if our guest wasn't really going along that line. But yes, there does seem to be some sort of foreign interference, yes.
Venezuela, Argentina.
And a rise of right-wing elements in all these countries.
And those are all the tweets for this week.
And that's all we have time for on Sputnik with me, Hafsa Kara Mustafa.
And me, Gayatri. But you can stay in touch with us through Twitter at RT_Sputnik or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. Until next week, it's been marvelous.